I hope everyone enjoyed the opening sessions. It was definitely very inspiring. My name's Dustin Tingley. I'm the faculty director of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning Research Group. I'm also a political scientist, so my academic hat is in the government department. We're really happy that you're here today. We have an amazing group of people. My colleague Andrew Ho, who's at the Ed School, but is also the faculty chair of the VPAL Research Committee. Some of the VPAL Research Committee is in this room. Many of you aren't. Those of you who aren't, we are very happy that you're interested in this general topic about using research to advance learning. So I thought what I would do is just very briefly talk a little bit about how I myself got interested in research in this space. And the reason is that part of the theme in this panel is that we want to make it very clear that research and the way we are thinking about it is something that is very inclusive. It is not simply a laboratory science, et cetera, but it is something that happens in a broad variety of ways. And our panelists are going to very much illustrate that. Today on the panel we have Andrew, Meira Levinson in the Ed School, Dan Levy, and Todd Rogers in the Kennedy School. And you're going to see that broad variety. So why did I become interested in it? Well, I'm a political scientist, and so these days I spend most of my time fielding questions about the presidential election, which I know absolutely nothing about. I study international affairs, and I really don't know who's going to win the election. I have preferences, but I don't know who's going to win. But I got interested in research on education in a very sort of different sense, which was how do we reduce the transaction costs for individual instructors to find and explore material that other instructors are engaging in. And so that was a very different, that was kind of like much more of an economics-y kind of research question rather than a learning science research question. But what that then led me to is all sorts of questions and explorations about what are the different types of data that are out there about teaching and learning, and how can we marshal them in a scalable way. That is to say, we are increasingly in an era where sometimes we have more data than we have ideas, and so we need to really constrain and manipulate the data in ways to make it helpful rather than be a hindrance. And so for me, that led to a very different style of what we might think about teaching and learning research to be. But again, as I said, this panel is all about, I think, helping to explore the broad landscape of what that research can be. And so with that introduction, I'd like to hand it over to Andrew Ho, who's going to facilitate a little bit more and talk about some of his work.
Thanks, Dustin. So the five of us have something in common, and actually two more people belong to this group. I want to just introduce the VPAL Research Committee to you, tell you a little bit about what we do, because all of the projects that you'll hear about today arose out of this group. But again, as Dustin said, part of our goal is to make you part of this group and get you to see yourselves as potentially part of this group. So again, my name is Andrew Ho. I'm a professor at the Graduate School of Education, and I also chair the VPAL Research Committee, Vice Provost for Advances in Learning. That's Peter Bull, who you'll see later today. Todd and Meira and Dan and also Judy and Logan and all the other fine people you see here from across the university have a common mission to both conduct research in teaching and learning, but also facilitate it and inspire it among you and across our university. So that's who we are, and the projects that you'll hear about today arose out of these discussions. But I want to say this VPAL Research Committee actually had its origins as the Harvard X Research Committee and pivoted maybe about just over a year ago to be more on campus and less online, although we still straddle both. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that, how some of the ideas that came from the Harvard X Research Committee sort of continue on in the VPAL Research Committee. So this is the Harvard X and MIT X course network. These are our massive open online courses. You'll remember we launched the edX platform jointly with MIT in 2012. And with all the data that we had from all of these courses, it was about 70 at the time, now it's well over 200 now, we could see not only what students did in class, but how they moved from class to class, right? And some of these networks are obvious. Peter Bohl's China X. A lot of people who started it kept going through subsequent modules. You'll see that up there, China X, A, B, and C. But there are also some really surprising connections, right? There is Michael Sandel's, let me give you some curricular areas here, right? Michael Sandel's justice course here. A lot of people moved from this course to the MITx course in philosophy. And so it sort of made us sort of think, why don't we know where so many of our students are coming from and where they're going to? What are the sort of latent course pathways throughout this university, and in this case, like across universities? And so that led to a question that I have that I'm just beginning to explore as part of this VPAL Research Committee. And this is called it's a nearest neighbors project. And again, we're all going to sort of describe the projects that we have. So here are the questions that I'm hoping I can answer with my nearest neighbors project. So they're very simple, and for the many of you who are instructors here, it's which Harvard instructor is currently teaching the most of your current students? So if you're teaching right now, think to yourselves, what course is this going on right now is teaching the most of your students? Can you answer that question? And I thought it would be sort of interesting and sometimes surprising in the same way that I showed you in this past network. It's like, well, what if like half of my course is coming from this other course that's teaching these interesting things, and I can connect and make connections to that other course as I'm teaching. That's an opportunity for learning and connection. It breaks down the walls of this classroom and makes us think broader. So second, which Harvard instructor taught the most of your current students last spring? Right, and Logan, I know, in the VPAL Research Committee has this question a lot because the physics pathways have very clear sequences. So sometimes the answer is very obvious, right? And sometimes the answer can be surprising. And similarly, which Harvard instructor will teach the most of your current students next spring? So we have the data to answer these questions, to reveal the sometimes latent and surprising pathways that we have throughout this university. So my goal with this modest project is to identify these like neighborhoods of courses that can sometimes be surprising, thoroughfares across Harvard University that we may not see. I have many students in Judy's class that became sort of my class sequence from the School of Public Health. What if I knew more about what that sequence looked like, what they learned, and could leverage that in my own teaching? And then nurture these neighborhoods and instructors, connect teaching fellows, share instructional materials, very similar to the project that the motivations that Dustin had. So that's my project, and you'll hear about more. But what I wanted to do briefly was sort of locate all the projects that Dan and Meira and Todd are going to describe in a kind of space that I hope you can locate yourself in. Right? We want this framework to be broad. You might think, maybe I'm not a researcher, maybe I'm not a data person, but we're trying to convince you that you are, that you can be part of this discussion, that you can be part of this initiative. So I want to create a dimension from usable data to research. You just might be interested in data that you can use that's interesting to you, like, for example, what teacher is currently teaching the most of my students, right? And you could also potentially do active research on that topic with an intent to publish. And you can also do it sometimes more in the teaching space and sometimes more in the learning space. And so I would describe my project as sort of usable data with teaching, right? Answer some simple questions about where your students came from, where they're going to, where they are now, to give you a sense of where they go after they leave your classrooms, right? Meira's, who's going to speak next, is going to talk about her Instructional Moves project, which maybe sits more sort of around here, usable data with teaching and learning. Dan Levy is going to talk about two-stage exams, which I'm determined to pilot, I think, hopefully next year. And then Todd is going to talk about a study supporters project, which is really more about research and learning. But these aren't dichotomies. But I hope that you can sort of see through our conversations today how broad this initiative is and how you can be part of it.
All right, so I'm going to talk about a project on instructional moves that I should say did not arise out of the VPAL Research Group, but it has been facilitated now by the VPAL Research Group, including some help in thinking about assessment on instructional moves in higher education. And so My background, I'm a political theorist by training, and then I became a school teacher. I taught 8th grade for 8 years over the period of a decade, and then I came back into academia. And so when I came to the ed school, I came very much with a K-12 teaching hat in mind. And one of the things that I came in just a couple of years before sort of the Hauser grant, before HILT took off. And one of the things that I was struck by in the work that we were doing through HILT was that oftentimes it felt to me as if we were reinventing and rediscovering moves that K-12 teachers already actually know, and that there's a fair amount of research about in terms of high-quality teaching, which these days is often broken down as a sort of a move that an instructor can make. So a high-leverage pedagogical strategy that may be applicable in multiple settings and is grounded in current knowledge about teaching and learning. This may include on the sort of micro-level wait time. It's the idea that after you ask a question, say you wait 7 seconds before you start calling on people to answer. Slightly more complexly, but not particularly, having people turn and talk after they've encountered a new concept in order to start constructing the understanding in their heads, right? Somewhat more complexly still, say thinking about formative and summative assessments, say rubrics. And then finally a very complex sort of instructional move, which is composed of multiple, micro moves potentially, something like an interactive lecture. Okay, so these kind of go from the discrete to the complex, but all of these are things that we can think of as high leverage things that have actually been studied quite extensively, especially in the K-12 setting. And I was interested in thinking about how can we transfer these to the higher education setting so that we are not then rediscovering and reinventing here at Harvard what is being done very competently, say, in the Boston, Brookline, Newton public schools, et cetera, already. So my idea was that I knew, right? So the second half of this is on knowledge. So I knew that I wanted to transfer high leverage pedagogies from K-12 to higher education. I knew what those were, right? As the capacity building, I thought, okay, we'll create videos that we're going to go into classrooms across the university. The idea is to show at least 3 classrooms from 3 different disciplines, ideally 3 different schools, to show that this is not just about the charisma of the instructor, something like that, right? And it's really actually about the move itself, show portraits of practice, talk to faculty and students, get some interviews here, how they're making sense of it, how they're using it, sharing, establishing the research base and linking it to further resources. And then on a competence like that we would sort of develop dissemination tools, say a website, et cetera, send it out, and that would help people become confident. So that's what I thought this project was about. I knew all of these things and those were the steps we were going to do. Well, then I realized there was actually new knowledge I needed to gain, and this is where the research side of thinking about how do we facilitate high quality teaching and learning at Harvard comes in. I realized that we had to figure out what kinds of pedagogies do faculty struggle with, right? What would they like to learn and do better at? I can have views about what we know about high leverage strategies. That doesn't mean that any of you or any of our colleagues around the university are actually interested in that, or that they may have issues. Then on the issue of capacity, we realize that there's a question about how will faculty access these resources. We can make these videos, right? But if they can also just sit unwatched, and or they may be unusable just by watching a video. Are they best used solo or with a guide? And what role, say, should the teaching and learning centers and coaches play that are now in a number of schools across the university? And then finally, on the issue of competence, I was interested in thinking about, there we are. Thank you. How will we know that our resources have been useful, right? How do we know that faculty are actually building their competence in using these resources? So what this led us to, great, can you just go to the next slide? There, oops, there we are. There, all right, terrific. So what that helped us realize is we needed to do research, not necessarily about the instructional moves themselves, but about these questions of what kind of knowledge do instructors want to gain and need to gain, how will they actually develop the capacity to use those resources, and then how can we know that they will have developed the competence and be better teachers and facilitate better learning at Harvard. And so this is just a short list of actually the kinds of assessments and research that we've now been doing in a formative way throughout the project. Doing a survey of teaching and learning lab colleagues around the universities, then we came back to the teaching and learning labs and we did a step back consultancy. We've been making some pilot videos that we then user tested, which was incredibly helpful. And one of the things that Andrew pointed out to us when we user tested with him was that it was actually a teaching and learning process through the user testing, not just for us, but for the faculty who was sort of talking with us to reflect about teaching. We're then going to do product testing in the mock-up, do website user testing, and eventually also web analytics. But this hopefully is showing that there's a mix of quite formative assessment and research that we're doing on this, and summative assessment, and that it's sort of feeding into an iterative cycle of research about teaching and learning in order to improve teaching and learning. And I will pass it on, I think, to Dan. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here. When Brooke and others approached us, the three panelists, to ask us to do this, we asked, so what is the goal of this session? And she said, to get everyone excited about conducting research about teaching. And we said, how much time do we have? And she said, 5 minutes each. So this is my attempt in 5 minutes to get you excited about conducting research about teaching. And what I will do is I will describe actually 3 research papers that I have been involved in examining some aspect of my teaching that have actually changed the way I teach. So the first one, as most faculty members, I have this thing on the syllabus that says, here are the readings you're supposed to do before each class. And what I discovered startlingly 10 years ago is that many of my students didn't seem to do that. And so I decided that maybe I could do some things to stimulate my students to read more. And I tried 2 techniques that many of us have used over time. The first technique is I asked students to post on the web answers to questions about the reading. The second one is I did some cold calling, this very widely known technique, certainly here in this room, although I'm not as intimidating as this guy or as the professors that tend to practice it here at the law school. But I did try these 2 techniques. And I conducted an experiment in which some students were subject to the conditions, these conditions here versus the control group. And here are the key findings from that experiment. Let you read it. And so this has had profound implications on how I think about what I want my students to do before class, and how what they do before class integrates to what we do in class. So that's study number 1. Study number 2 is about polling students through hand raising. So one of the most universal and old teaching techniques is to ask students how they think or understand a particular issue by asking them, raise your hand if you think X, or raise your hand if you think Y. And I started wondering whether clickers or more anonymous polling technologies would perhaps generate different results than if you ask students to raise your hand. So for example, if I ask you now, please raise your hand if you're finding this talk to be boring, probably a lot of you won't raise your hand, not because you don't think the talk is boring, but rather because you are sort of there are social norms that might prevent you, or you might decide to herd and do as others do. So what we decided with some colleagues is we went to a bunch of classrooms and randomly assigned half of the room to respond some questions with a raise of hands, and the other half of the room to respond to the same questions using clickers. And here's how we found. Here's what we found. So this has had profound implications not only on whether I use the hand-raising technique or not in class, or use clickers or other technologies, but in general how I gather evidence about my students learning in the classroom and how I gather evidence more generally. The third paper is the one that Andrew referred to, is making exams a learning experience. And this is joint work with Meiklinger and Teddy's Voronos. And I have been a little bit frustrated by what I think is the natural cycle of exams. So this is what I think happens. Students take an exam, and at least in my case, I've seen my students do this. After the exam, this is what they do. They go and party. They don't necessarily reflect on the exams. So the exam becomes, in my courses at least, have been mostly very summative kind of experience, not really formative. Not much happens other than, did you get this question right or not? And in fact, I even collected data on whether students check the solutions to the exams, and alarmingly small proportion seems to do that. And so the question is, can we do something in between these two things that might generate more reflection about the learning in exams than nature would normally suggest? And this is where the group stage exam, which has been used in physics and other disciplines, comes in. So what if immediately after they take the individual exam, you could give them a subset of the exam to work in groups, and then they have to submit that subset to you as part of the exam. So it counts as a second stage of the exam. And so this is research in process. In fact, it's being supported by VPAL Research. But here are some findings so far. I'll let you read this. So this has changed the way I think about exams and how I use them. And in fact, right now in all my courses, exams are two-stage exams, partly as a consequence of this experimentation. So I think we're about 4 minutes and 53 seconds now, so I'm going to stop here, but I hope this got you excited. If you have questions, here is my email, and hopefully we'll have some Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Can I just black screen?
Totally.
Hi, my name is Todd Rogers. I'm a professor at the Kennedy School. Before coming to the Kennedy School, I was a Democratic pollster, and I realized there was a science of behavior change that wasn't being used in politics. So I got my PhD at the business school in the psychology department in the interdisciplinary program. And then went down to DC and ran a think tank where we translated behavioral science insights into political strategy for the infrastructure of the left. And so worked with the Democratic Party and the campaigns and the independent expenditure groups, doing fast cycle randomized experiments, trying to develop best practices that we could replicate election over election that would inform practices and tactics. And so things like for Get Out the Vote, we tripled the impact per dollar spent on voter mobilization by developing these behavioral science-informed pieces like everybody says they're going to vote, but only about half of people actually do who say they're going to vote. Some people are lying, obviously, but some people intend to vote but simply fail to follow through. Asking them to make a concrete implementation plan, what time will you vote, how will you get there, where will you be coming from, more than doubles the impact per contact. And so now if any of you do canvassing or get these annoying phone calls or people knocking your doors, they almost always ask you what time will you vote. It seems invasive, but it'll make you more likely to follow through. I then decided I didn't want to do politics anymore, and the joke that I usually tell to transition is because instead I want to do something important, and so I shifted to education research. But now I feel like that's a sort of an offensive joke because I do think the election's important. And so instead I came back to Kennedy School, and my lab is called the Student Social Support R&D Lab. We develop low-cost, scalable interventions that mobilize and empower the social network around students outside of school, friends and family. We do a whole host of things in K-12 through college, but I want to talk about one of those buckets, which is inviting and empowering people who care about students to be more active supporters of the student's education. And so it was inspired by a focus group I did at a community college about 5 years ago, where I asked, who cares whether you finish college? And one student says, my grandmother asks me all the time. Another says, my partner pesters me every night. Another person says, my manager at Home Depot every time I go in asks me. And so it dawned on me that all of those people care and have absolutely nothing to do with the systems built, the institutions built to support student success. And so what we did was we developed a program called the Study Supporter Project, where when a student enrolls, they name a friend or family member who cares about them, who's not in the program with them, but who wants them to succeed. And then each week we'll text them a message that is to both unambiguously invite them to play a role and gives them something substantive they can talk about. So for example, I might name Meira and I'll say, and Meira, this week Todd learned about Oedipus, ask him why Oedipus poked his own eyes out. And then the next week it'll be like, Todd has a midterm this week, ask him what his study plan is. The next week it'll be, this week Todd has to make a decision about next semester, ask him what his re-enrollment plan is. So it introduces accountability, social support, and unambiguously invites the social network to be supporters. With the help of VPAL and Dustin and Andrew, we did this in HX, in Harvard X, in a bunch of different courses. Sometimes to really strong results and sometimes not. And it appears, we're still sort of figuring out what's going on. It appears that the more the student the more professionally relevant the course, the more effective it will be. So then we've done it in community colleges around the country, in the UK and in Canada. And to put it in context, the best interventions we know to increase student persistence in college is advisors and mentors who increase semester over semester re-enrollment about 5 percentage points. And they cost $500 per student per semester. So our little intervention, which is trivial marginal cost, increases college persistence in these community colleges and online universities, accredited universities, about between 4 and 5 percentage points. And we have only just sort of started tinkering with it. Now we're starting to refine how to make these things more potent. And the big picture is trying to view the social network that surrounds a student in K-12 and in college as a potential asset to be invested in and empowered and invited to play a more active supportive role, rather than as just sort of this outside thing that either distracts students or asks them during the Christmas holiday how school's going. We're about to launch this spring in the Harvard Extension School, which we're excited about, both because we think this is most potent when it's a non-residential experience. We don't have evidence for that, but it makes the most sense. And also because because it's local, we get to do much more qualitative interviewing to sort of talk to students about their experience. Right now we've sort of been impoverished because we're working in London or in Indiana or in Colorado. So it's been hard to actually pin down students. So that's the sort of next step with the support of, because it's in the Harvard system, VPAL's been really supportive and encouraging of it. Big picture philosophy of the whole approach is often there's a deficit-based view of families, that families are the problem when kids are low achieving and low performing. And with collaborators and friends, and especially when Karen and Matt at the Ed School, we sort of view things as that these families are assets rather than deficits, and the idea is how do we invest in them as resources to support student achievement.